When I was doing my master's at the Hebrew University, I worked in Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha and Septuagint. Then I discovered that I could work in the original language, text in the original language, by working in the scrolls in Hebrew and Aramaic. And that's really what got me interested.
So I did my BA in the United States, and my BA is actually in mathematics. I did my BA at Yeshiva University, so I took many courses in Jewish studies. At the end of my BA, I debated whether to continue in mathematics or Jewish studies. I decided to continue in mathematics, and I started a PhD in mathematics. Soon after that, I decided, though, this wasn't what I wanted to do forever.
So Hebrew University was very involved in the beginning. It's a well-known story, not a myth, but really a mythological history, that Eliezer Lipa Sukenik on the 29th of November, the day of the UN partition vote, made his way to Bethlehem and authenticated scrolls, and during that visit and a few weeks later managed to purchase 3 scrolls for the Hebrew University, and there was really the first publication of the scrolls. And then his son Segal in the 1950s managed to purchase 4 more scrolls for the state of Israel, really, through an advertisement in the Wall Street Journal, right? That's a famous story as well. And then in 1967, Segal Yadin dug up the Temple Scroll, which is our longest scroll in Bethlehem, and he published that as well. Of course, what happened was in 1947, that whole area of Qumran and East Jerusalem, where the Rockefeller was and all the scrolls were taken, was basically lost to Hebrew University Jewish people, and really all scholars except for the handful of representatives from the various archaeological institutes that were working on the scrolls. And so no one had access to that material really for decades. Even after 1967, the copyright, if you could say it, kind of gentlemen's agreement was to let the original scholars continue their work until it became clear that they weren't getting the material published. And then in the 1980s, there was a lot of pressure on the Israel Antiquities Authority to release the scrolls. And the final clincher, I think, was the run-up to the first Gulf War. The IAA, Israel Antiquities Authority, deposited photos of the scrolls in various libraries in New York, in Oxford, and in LA, and the LA library released the photos of the scrolls, and that was sort of the end of the old story, and the new chapter began. Emmanuel Tov was appointed editor-in-chief, 1990, of the scrolls, and the whole world of scrolls opened up at that point. And since then, Hebrew University has been really, I think, the leading, not just I think, but I think everyone would agree, the leading institution for the study and publication of the scrolls.
There are other places which have opened various kinds of centers, but nothing on the scale, both in terms of the numbers of scholars, the quality of scholars. Jerusalem, for obvious reasons, is a mecca for scholars in Jewish studies, but the concentration we have here of scholars who study Dead Sea Scrolls, but also all the fields surrounding Dead Sea Scrolls in Jewish studies and early Christianity, is unparalleled anywhere else in the world. It's a wonderful place to be because everybody comes to you.
And students also.
And students
we have
well.
Lots of students coming through, studying at the Hebrew University for short term, longer term, and they come to the center and they work as interns and they attend the conferences, and we really support that. So yes, as Michael said, there's no place that really has the scope and the depth that we have here.
So I think it depends. The question can be asked or divided amongst different fields. I'm a scholar of the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. So even within the field of Hebrew Bible studies or biblical studies, there are a number of different directions where the scrolls have changed our perspective. So let's first start with the text of the Bible. Even before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, we already knew that other texts existed, such as the Septuagint, the Hebrew text behind the Septuagint, the Forlag of the Septuagint, the Samaritan Pentateuch, etc. But the approximately 200 biblical scrolls that we have from the Dead Sea give us a window or a snapshot onto the text in its original language. what was the nature of the biblical text in this period. Most of the texts that we have of the Bible are in Hebrew are from the medieval period and on, from the 10th century CE and on. In Greek, before the discovery of papyri, we had the main codices are from the 4th and 5th century and on. Qumran and Greek papyri pushed that back hundreds of years, if not 1,000 years. What did the Bible look like? What was the text of the Bible like? And the answer is that it wasn't exactly like we have it today, right? It's different. What's interesting are the differences between the biblical text in that period. There are some texts that are similar or identical to what we have, but there are many that are different. Everything from differences in what we call orthography and morphology. Orthography is how words are written when they're written without vowels, using certain letters in Hebrew to help you pronounce them. Morphology is linguistic, the form of forms of words, but all the way to differences in content, sometimes theological differences, which I've been very interested in the past, I guess 15 years already or so, decade to 15 years, in what we call rewritten biblical texts. We generally think of the biblical text as static, as unchanging. It's not just that there are differences and slight differences, but that it's this constant process of updating and revision. Religious texts are constantly on the move, and because they are important religious texts, they're constantly rewriting them and reworking them. You can show examples in Jubilees, work from the 2nd century BCE, which seems to use two different versions, but we have it in the Qumran, in Qumran K4, which is the richest repository of texts. You have, just to give you an example, the book of Jeremiah. We have two different versions of the book of Jeremiah, a long version and a short version, which we knew about before Qumran. In the Septuagint, we have a shorter version, and in our text, which we have from medieval codices, is the longer version. And then in K4, it was a huge surprise. It was I don't know if it was shocking, but you have the long version and the short version next to each other. When I say next to each other, we don't know exactly how they were found, but in the same cave, you have the long version in Hebrew of Jeremiah and the short version in Hebrew of Jeremiah.
One, I think, some paradigm shift was in the early, even the first decades of Qumran research. Before Emmanuel Tov took over, enlarged the team, and started publishing everything. The scholarly concept was one of a complete break and no contact, and that's the impression that one gets from reading the sectarian's own writings. But then when you look at the complete corpus, and I would say, about a third of the corpus at least are works that are not biblical and they're not sectarian, but they're the whole gamut of Jewish literature, and there are also works in there like Ben Sira that are quite far from them ideologically. So you see there was more exposure and more of a willingness to use books that didn't agree with their own particular ideology. Certainly for the first few centuries, there was a lot more contact. I mean, you know that. There's railing against Christians going to synagogue services, and there's evidence of Christian knowledge of Jewish books, of Second Temple works. This is something I've shown in terms of New Testament, Didache, apostolic constitutions. I think there was a lot more contact than later scholars and later theologians would like to admit.
Yeah, I just to emphasize it even more, because at the moment it was set up not a dichotomy, but a trichotomy, I guess, of sectarian, biblical, and then everything in between. I would say even in the sectarian texts, even though in the famous halachic letter, or MMT, it says parash numero va'am, specifically what we want to call it messianic expectation, or I would prefer apocalyptic thinking or expecting the eschaton, is part of common Judaism in the period, right? We have it in Daniel, which is in the Hebrew Bible. We have it in other works which aren't sectarian. Enoch, it's in Jubilees. We have an early Christian text. One of my teachers, Menachem Kister, who also wrote a book on the common heritage, he called it, because frequently, especially when we talk about sectarian debates, we like to emphasize the difference between groups. But if you sort of look at what's common to the groups, their basis, and they're all discussing or frequently discussing the same biblical passages. So even though we like to emphasize the difference, and we like to emphasize whether we call it parting of the ways or sectarianism or whatever we want to call it, ultimately the shared heritage I think is much more pronounced when you take a step back. Hellenistic Judaism, I think is Judaism in the land of Israel. At least the apocalyptic parts of Daniel which I don't think are that different in terms of their expectation. I agree with you, reading Hellenistic Jewish texts, there is a difference. I think in rabbinic texts, especially early rabbinic texts, even when they part ways, you can frequently read it as a reaction or a response, if we're talking about apocalyptic texts, to being promoted in texts like that. So I would read the rabbinic texts in that same world as well. I'm not suggesting that I think Hellenistic Jewish texts need to be also read as part of this larger picture. I'm not in any way suggesting they shouldn't be. But I think you are correct that there's something different going on, and I think it has to do with the cultural milieu in which they were composed and written. So I don't want to go that far.
I would go that far.
Okay, you would go that far. I don't know. They clearly had access to certain traditions. I'm not going to say the rabbis had access to Enoch and said no, but they clearly know about traditions about Enoch because they work very hard to make Enoch much less mythological than he is. Do the rabbis know about other biblical texts, for example? So they do. Sometimes they even quote from them, not realizing they're from other biblical texts. Certainly not the quantity and quality of the differences, but they seem to have access to some of this material. I think the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE was there's a debate now, was it a watershed moment? I think people exaggerate now that it's not. I think it's impossible for it not to have had a theological impact, but and also the way people, after the destruction of the temple, when there's no more temple to access God, it works through text. So then texts actually change their religious function, exactly.
I don't think there's evidence that they actually read the Dead Sea Scrolls. However, I would say that there is a lot of evidence that they had the same traditions, not just the same methodology, hermeneutics, interpretive methods. As you can see it in the pushback, but also in the continuity of language. You see it in liturgy, in halacha, in Jewish law. You see it in the interpretation, narrative exegesis. There, you can trace a lot of the threads through in all of these traditional areas of Jewish studies. So I think, common heritage, common traditions, and a great deal of it. I think there's a different dialectic. I think that is for sure. I think in terms of the literary aspect of the exegesis, yes, but not in terms of the tools, not in terms of the exegetical tools. One thing that we now know about the scrolls is that, yes, they are very dogmatic. You're absolutely right, They're very, very dogmatic. But when you look at the plethora of sectarian writings, you can see different shades of the most famous ideologies there. Of the dualism, is it inside, is it outside, how much deterministic is it? There are different shades which are often interpreted as resulting from different sources or different times within the sect's 200-year history. But they still somehow held them together, and they held the whole corpus together, which, as I said before, has different ideas in it. We thought, while we had was rabbinics, that, that there was oral law and there was nothing written down of halakha, of Jewish liturgy, of any of these fields. And then, lo and behold, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. And you know what? A lot of what they call oral Torah, oral law, is written.
Okay, so some of these issues have already been touched on in this interview. But let's start just with the sort of in the field as a whole. If we're looking at the 75 years since the discovery, the early years, there was much more of an emphasis on the connections of the scrolls to Christianity, which had a lot to do with the identity of the original scholars who were assigned to work on the scrolls. It actually wasn't as much the case at Hebrew University. Professor Flusser, of course, did, but Shmaryahu Talmon, Chaim Rabin, Yadin, Sukenik, these are all scholars who already then put an emphasis on the Jewish background of the Dead Sea Scrolls. At the Hebrew University, as in many departments of Jewish studies especially, we have a philological emphasis. We read the texts and try to emphasize the text using all of the tools at our disposal in order to understand what the text meant, its historical context, etc. That tradition still continues amongst the younger generation of scholars. But there are new methods that have, and new theories that have come up, and some of them already, 30, 40 years ago. So to give an example in biblical studies, Emmanuel Tov has some very influential studies on theories of the biblical text, how the biblical text came into be, how to define groups of biblical texts. Until the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were certain models, primarily that of the Albright Cross school, of how to define a three-part division of different kinds of scrolls. That's been changed. I think, once again, from my perspective, I don't want to say my perspective has changed everybody's, but from my perspective, what has changed my own perspective is this process of rewriting these dynamic processes, which, if you go back, one could have already found or seen this by looking at the Septuagint and comparing books. But until you have quantity and works in their original languages, it's very hard to see. So I think we're seeing a paradigm shift in textual criticism of the Hebrew Bible as well. We've seen paradigm shifts in the history of biblical interpretation. And once again, much of this was already there beforehand. And this is not to take away, for example, from Judeo-Hellenistic Jewish biblical interpreters, which are, there too we've had paradigm shifts. But certainly the discovery of certain compositions has reinvigorated and provided new material, which has allowed us to understand the wealth and breadth of interpretation. Recently, there's been a lot of work, or more work, I don't know if a lot of work, but more work on material aspects of the scrolls. This started, I think, in two different directions. One has to do with a larger trend in philological studies about taking material aspects of manuscripts into account when understanding the context in which these compositions were read and understood. And that is going on in Dead Sea Scroll studies as well as within the broader context of how it's going on in ancient Judaism and biblical studies. That's one side. And the other side is incorporation of scientific methods. There are people who have studied, let's say, for example, DNA of leather on which scrolls are written. And you can see, is this cow or calf, I don't know, I'm not a leather expert. Is it taken from the same animal? Is it taken from a different area? And you can do studies on almost anything. You can take the bones from the cemetery and assess, are they male, female, children? And these are all questions that are important. And then sort of the most recent work in terms of scientific bringing in is the use of digital humanities in general. Both in towards reconstructing. We're talking about, keep on talking about scrolls, but really we're talking about tens of thousands of fragments. So reconstructing texts, how they should be reconstructed, how they can be pieced together again, doing handwriting analysis using, is it the same scribe that's writing 1Q Isaiah A from beginning to end? These are all questions that have come to the fore, and they parallel trends in other fields as well, right? So now we're using those same methods on texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. So there are two things. One is, and this is something that the project of the Israel Antiquities Authority, the Leon Levy Digital Library, rescanned many of the scrolls starting probably 15 years ago already, using new methods for imaging. And there it wasn't completely new scrolls, but they were able to use the imaging techniques to see words. Emmanuel Tov and I, together with a professor from University of Kentucky, Brent Seals, this made the New York Times and made Science, I think it's probably my only article that will ever appear in Science. I assume Science Advances. There was a burned scroll from Ein Gedi, from the synagogue in Ein Gedi, which we were able to, we didn't do the scanning, we did the reading. But the Israel Antiquities Authority, they provided scans. Brent Seals, and this in some ways was the most important part of the study, provided the computer algorithms to open up the scroll, even though it wasn't opened up, it's virtually opened up, because if you tried to open it up, it would crack, and then we were able to read it like a regular scroll. Most of the kinds of things we have today are, if you can read a little bit more and you know how to place the scrolls, you know how much space is left, you can sometimes say important things about the scrolls and understand the structure and sometimes meaning of a composition better.
That, I think, is a major paradigm shift, even to the extent that in 1997, for the 50th anniversary of the Scrolls, we took general public on tours of the Shrine of the Book. And we went down to Qumran, and the rooms were still labeled as they are in Christian monasteries. And when you went through the Shrine of the Book at the entrance, it was the monastic male community, a smaller satellite community where they had, they lived a family life, for procreation. And in the 1990s, when there was open access to the scrolls, and also the team went from 7 or 8 male Christian scholars, many of whom were, monks themselves. All of a sudden, there were 98 scholars, and there were young scholars and older scholars, and there were men, and there were women, and there were Christians, and there were Jews. So the combination of the opening of the scrolls and the opening of the team allowed us to finally see that there really was a greater presence of women in the scrolls. At the same time, there was a re-examination of the bones in the cemetery. They were located again in Germany and in France. And at least some of the skeletons in the main cemetery, 3 skeletons at least, were definitely of the 39 or 36 that could be gendered, or were female adults and buried in the main cemetery the same way. And so we have to at least say there were some women. I can't say they were the majority, but there were some women who were present at Qumran, who were honored in the same way. We have texts now that talk about honoring the mothers as well as the fathers. We have a text of the Damascus document, which was originally found in the Cairo Geniza, but found in many copies at Qumran, which talks about knowledgeable and trustworthy women who were examiners and whose results of the examinations of women with a bad reputation, but their examination was brought before, so they were in this capacity, or women who could come before the community or before even, court of the community and give testimony on certain issues. So that is a major paradigm shift. So I think a lot of it had to do with our teachers. Certainly Michael Stone and certainly Emanuel Tovin encouraged women as much as men. I mean, I even managed to study with David Flusser, and it was almost like he was gender blind. That is, he spoke to you as a person, and I think a lot of it had to do with our teachers.
I actually think what you said about a young field is part of the story, because both in very much in New Testament criticism, but also in Hebrew Bible, there are certain sort of figures. Almost all of the canonical scholars and figures are men. And the early generation of Qumran scholars were mostly men also, but it wasn't soon after that. It's not sort of the same mythological. When I say mythological, I'm not actual scholars, but I'm talking about the people who are the founders of the field. And I would add, Qumran studies, even though sometimes from the outside, especially if you come into a session and people are speaking about 4Q this and 11Q this, it seems like a secret sect. But it actually is a very open and welcoming to young scholars as well. And I hope that continues as we go on.
Yeah, we don't have much information about who was praying what, men versus women. There is one text in which there are men and women who are actually saying blessings and thanksgivings. We do have one text like that, which was originally called the marriage. We don't know, marriage ritual, then it got renamed Golden Age ritual, then it got renamed New Year's ritual. But yes, there are actually women there who are saying some of the blessings, so that's very interesting. I think, first of all, I'm standing now on the shoulders of Eileen Schuler, who was the first one to break open this field. And she says in some of her articles, every 10 years she writes another one about women in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that the first time she spoke about this, people were looking around, this is an issue, this is a topic. I mean, so I think people now understand. And there's a different way of looking at the text. And for example, Maxine Grossman wrote a very, very important article a few years ago, in which she showed that much of the language of the scrolls, specifically Serach HaYachad, for example, the community rule, which is the major foundation document in terms of the rules, basically it's gender neutral, because the language that's used to describe community members is not male, but it's person, it's ish, it's anashim. And so there are new facts on the ground because we have new texts, but there's also a new perspective in terms of how to look at language and kind of opening our eyes to being able to see a text as being gender neutral. If you go to translations of the community rule, every time ish or anashim, which are gender neutral terms for a person and people, are translated, in almost every single translation, it's going to be translated as man and men. So I think this is something that has to change. It has to keep up with our new perspectives on the texts.
Sort of my earliest work, but that continued into Jubilees, had to do with these, what we call reworked Pentateuch texts, which I think was the first that was published as texts that are no longer Pentateuch. They're different, and this goes back to what I was discussing before. I claim that these are actually texts of the Pentateuch, and we just have to recognize that the processes of development are dynamic, that they're constantly, texts are growing and changing, and sometimes in unexpected ways. Which led me into my work on Jubilees. Originally, when I worked on Jubilees, I myself started with a very static perspective. The author of Jubilees rewrites Genesis and Exodus, and somehow you go from point A to point B, and it's simple. But what I realized in my study, or what I attempted to demonstrate in my studies, are that it's a much more complex process getting from point A to point B. And in fact, you can show that there are many stages in the middle, and that it's not just one person. This is sort of a communal project. I don't mean communal in the sense of the Qumran sect, because it's not clear to me it's from Qumran, even though we have 15 copies of this book from the 2nd century BCE. What I would identify as what I call the final redactional stages of Jubilees line up with the classical sectarian texts from Qumran. These processes are much more complex, and therefore our models that we posit for development have to be more complex as well. Part of the argument for showing that is to show that within Jubilees there are, I would say, dozens of contradictions that people either, when I say people, modern scholars, and most modern scholars have glossed over these contradictions. People have noted some of them, especially Menachem Kister sort of started in this direction, but I sort of blew open the door in terms of identifying contradictions, and I think you can see a tendency in scholarship to try to harmonize these as opposed to understanding the implications. Sort of parallel to that, I started after in my work on Daniel, a few things are of great interest to me there. One is the differences between what we call the Masoretic text, which in this case is not just Hebrew, it's Hebrew and Aramaic, and the Greek versions, in particular what we call the Old Greek version of Daniel, which has significant differences from the Masoretic text, especially in Daniel 3 to 6. But I think once again, when you examine the relationship between the texts, the model is actually a model of dynamic revision and development. That's how to explain the connections between them. In my most recent work on Daniel, I've been discussing the apocalyptic sections of Daniel 7 to 12, and I've attempted to show there too how you can see, both starting within the book of Daniel 7, which is an Aramaic apocalypse, reading it separately from 8 to 12. All scholars agree it's earlier, but most of the time many scholars read it together with 8 to 12. Read Daniel 7 on its own. I think if you read Daniel 7 on its own, it has a very different meaning than it does when read together with 8 and 12. And because of that, I think 8 to 12 should be viewed as interpretations and developments of 7, and I think you can trace those trajectories all the way to, here we're talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, through to the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can see development of Daniel 7 in what's called 4Q 246, the Son of God text. And then recently I gave some lectures showing how both in 3 different Qumran texts, in the Ward Scroll, which is already noted, see the development of Daniel 11, but also in 4Q 174, which is now, you can see further development there. And then my most recent lecture about 4Q 248, what's called historical text, which you can show there. The same constant development, constant dynamic development. Authors are reading what they see before them. They have sort of this ever-expanding basis of texts that need to be interpreted with one another. Just one final point, because you asked specifically about the Greek texts from Qumran. So there I've only related to them in footnotes. What's most interesting about them is they are not identical with what we have in the great codices of the 4th and 5th century. So then the question is, what is the relationship between that and what we then call the Old Greek or the Septuagint? More interestingly, though, but this is not about Dead Sea Scrolls, but I'll throw it in anyway because it has to do with my work, are papyri that we have from Egypt of the Greek translation. And there, specifically what I mentioned before, in the case of Daniel, we have what's called Papyrus 967, which is one of only 3 copies we have of the Old Greek, and the most important copy of the Old Greek, which only now is really being fully integrated into Daniel studies, because it gives us evidence of the original Greek translation, which is very different than what we have in the Masoretic text. And then over time, that scribes and primarily Christian exegetes, but also Jewish exegetes, tried to take that very different Greek translation and revise it to be closer to the Masoretic text. So the fact that we now have this early papyrus allows us to to have access to this text, which allows us to emphasize the difference even more. And based on those large-scale differences, as I said, I'm a big fan of the word textual dynamics now to describe how I perceive of the biblical text in antiquity. The earliest studies, Lieberman already had what to say about these texts when they were first discovered, about vulgar texts. Sometimes that's the way paradigms work also, that there are shifts and then there are shifts back. And so I agree with you that, and we should be doing this, and I try to do this, but perhaps I should be doing it more. Sort of the broader you cast your net of material, and here it shouldn't be surprising in any way because we know about Hellenization. We know some about Hellenization in the land of Israel at the time. So obviously that should affect textual transmission or textual development as well. And as you know, there are similar processes that take place there as well, although not always identical. It's not always identical from composition to composition. In other words, I've now used the same sentence 2 or 3 times in lectures and articles where I ended about textual dynamics, that it frequently happens in unexpected and surprising ways. Right? It's not something that I can tell you in advance. This text will, couldn't be predicted how it was going to develop. But when I have the stages lined up, I can then reverse engineer it to see how it happened. So every text is its own, is both part of this larger scribal culture, and each one is its own story.
Well, I'm going to pick up on something that Michael said, which is I think we need to cast our net wider. And this is something the Orion Center did from the very beginning. Even before everything was published, we were already Center for the Dead Sea Scrolls and Associated Literature, with the understanding that we have to relate to everything, not just the literature that's being produced in the land of Israel, but also the Hellenistic literature, and also diachronically back, of course, to the earlier books of the Hebrew Bible, but also ahead to Rabbinic Judaism and to early Christianity, and see what the connections are. Look at the similarities, and when you line up the texts, whether they're biblical texts or whether it's exegetical or whether it's literature or halakha, you see the similarities, but you also see the differences, and you can say, aha, this is where it went. So I think, yes, to continue to cast the net wider, both in terms of the texts that we study and also in terms of the people with whom we study in different fields, in different countries. And I think ultimately we should bring up the subject of artificial intelligence, because I know has this project, but I can see already, just from what, for example, I've done recently in preparing an exam with students, that it has its limitations. It's very, very good as databases are, electronic databases, for getting a lot of material, but ultimately, once it'll get to us to a lot more material faster, but there's always going to be a need for the human analysis and correctives.
Even if we think we know where it's going, my guess is that if we do an interview like this in 20 years, the Qumran studies will have grown in surprising and unexpected ways.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sure.